General Hospital spoilers tease that the storm brewing over Port Charles is about to crash down on Maxie Jones with the weight of both legal peril and personal betrayal. It began with Natalia Ramirez, a woman whose sharp tongue and sharper instincts had long been a fixture in the circle of Deception's leadership. Before her sudden and tragic death, Natalia had sat across from the women of Deception and told them something that would twist their world inside out. Sonny Corinthos, their powerful and often polarizing investor, had unknowingly funneled dirty money into their company. The revelation was like a shard of glass lodged in the heart of their business, its edges cutting deeper the more they tried to ignore it. They had returned the money to Sonny in an attempt to cleanse their books, but paper trails do not vanish simply because cash changes hands. The transaction was documented, scrutinizable, and in the wrong light, it could look damning for all involved. Natalia's death did not erase her words. If anything, it gave them the gravity of a final confession, the kind that lingers in the air long after the speaker is gone. For Maxie, it was a moral imperative to act. She could not see any path forward that did not involve going to the police. In her mind, the truth was the only shield she had, a fragile one, but still better than standing unarmed against a legal system that might discover their secret on its own terms. For Tracy Quartermaine, however, truth was a weapon best sheathed, and for Brooke Lynn and Lucy Coe, silence was the only strategy that could save them from ruin. The discussion over what to do stretched into tense hours, voices rising and falling like a tide, but in the end, democracy proved Maxie's enemy. The vote was 3-1. Maxie's defeat in the drawing room of the Quartermaine mansion was not just about numbers, it was about power, and hers had just been stripped away. She sat in her chair, shoulders rigid, feeling as though the walls themselves had conspired against her. She could see it in Tracy's eyes, the cool calculation, the measured patience of someone who had survived 1,000 battles by never flinching first. She could hear the discomfort in Brooke Lynn's voice, the slight tremor that betrayed her loyalty to family over friendship. And she could sense Lucy's quiet resignation, the choice to live with compromise rather than risk everything. When Maxie finally rose, it was with the stiff dignity of someone who refused to let them see her shake. She left without another word, Lucy trailing behind her, and the heavy front doors closed with a muffled finality that seemed to seal more than just the physical space between them. Upstairs, Brooke Lynn turned to Tracy, the air still thick with the echoes of their confrontation. "She's not going to let this go," she murmured. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. Maxie had the kind of stubbornness that could move mountains, or bury them under rubble. Tracy's expression didn't shift. "Then we make sure she can't do any damage." The words were quiet, but they had a weight that made Brooke Lynn look at her more closely. There was something dangerous there, an intent sharpened into a plan not yet spoken aloud. Tracy began with the simplest option, sending Maxie out of town. A fabricated work assignment, a project too important to refuse. Somewhere far enough from Port Charles, and more importantly, from the police, including Max Scorpio, the man who had practically raised her. Distance could be a leash if applied correctly. The problem was that distance phrase. Sooner or later, Maxie would come back, and when she did, she could still open her mouth and bring the walls of deception crashing down. That was when Tracy began to consider something darker. Her mind worked like a chessboard, each piece moved not for the sake of the immediate turn, but for the inevitable checkmate. What if Maxie could be recast as the architect of the crime? It wouldn't take much, a few carefully placed documents, a narrative framed just so. Natalia was no longer alive to contradict anything, and Tracy knew the dead could be made to speak in ways that served the living. If she could suggest, even subtly, that Natalia and Maxie had conspired to accept Sonny's dirty money without the knowledge of the others, the burden of guilt would shift entirely. The law loves a neat story, and a lone culprit is always easier to prosecute than a web of accomplices. Brooke Lynn recoiled slightly as Tracy spoke of contingencies. She didn't like the idea of ruining Maxie's life, but she also didn't like the image of herself in prison stripes. "You're talking about setting her up," she said, her voice a mix of accusation and disbelief. Tracy didn't answer directly. She only reminded her granddaughter that survival in their world often came at the cost of someone else's downfall. Meanwhile, Maxie walked through the streets of Port Charles with her thoughts swirling like storm clouds. Every instinct told her to go to Mac, to lay out the truth and let him guide her through the legal labyrinth. But every memory of her time at deception, every face she'd built trust with, tugged her back. She could feel Natalia's absence as a hollow space beside her, one that seemed to whisper warnings she couldn't fully understand. That night, she sat alone in her apartment, laptop open, the police department's non-emergency number glowing on the screen. Her finger hovered over the keys, but she didn't press them. She thought of her children, of the life she had clawed her way back to after every setback. She thought of the shame that would come with public scandal, and of the icy satisfaction she imagined on Tracy's face if she failed. The decision to stay silent was not one she had made yet, but the weight of it was already pressing down on her. At the Quartermaine mansion, Tracy was already moving forward. She contacted an associate known for discretion, someone who could make inconvenient details disappear and inconvenient people look guilty. Brooke Lynn watched from the edges, her conscience gnawing at her resolve. She wondered if they were crossing a line they could never uncross. But in the shadow of potential ruin, the line seemed less like a boundary and more like a suggestion. The days that followed saw Maxie growing increasingly uneasy. Every phone call felt like a prelude to confrontation. She noticed a man watching her from across the street one afternoon, though when she turned for a second look, he was gone. Lucy, ever intuitive, sensed her tension and tried to draw her out, but Maxie kept her worries close. If she was being set up, she couldn't yet see the full shape of the trap. Tracy, on the other hand, could see it perfectly. And she was patient. The trick to removing a piece from the board was to let it move into position willingly. Maxie's unease grew with every passing day, her instincts warning her that something was shifting beneath her feet. The air around her felt charged, as if everyone she passed in Port Charles knew something she did not. Even simple encounters at the coffee shop or the park seemed laced with an edge she couldn't quite name. She began to notice small, unsettling things. An email from the deception accounting department referencing documents she had never seen, a courier delivering a manila envelope addressed to her that contained nothing but photocopies of transaction records involving Sunny's investment, and a single anonymous note written in block letters that read, "You can't hide from the truth." The problem was, Maxie wasn't hiding, at least, not in the way this implied. Across town, Tracy was orchestrating the next phase of her plan with a precision born from decades of navigating both corporate and personal wars. She understood that if Maxie were to be convincingly framed, the story had to be airtight, each detail fitting seamlessly into a narrative the authorities would accept without hesitation. The first step was planting the seeds. Tracy quietly arranged for certain financial records to be discovered by someone in Deception's junior staff, documents suggesting that Maxie and Natalia had been in direct contact with Sunny regarding the investment, and that they had bypassed the rest of the leadership in finalizing the deal. The handwriting of the annotations in the margins was convincingly similar to Maxie's, thanks to a hired forger who knew exactly how to replicate her style. Brooke Lynn watched all of this unfold from the sidelines, her stomach in knots. She wanted to believe there was another way, but the fear of prison, of losing her music, her life, her family, kept her silent. Every time she looked at Tracy, she saw the calm certainty of someone who had already decided the outcome. Lucy, meanwhile, was caught in her own turmoil. She was not privy to the full scope of Tracy's plan, but she sensed that the situation was becoming more dangerous than any of them had anticipated. Her calls to Maxie became more frequent, but Maxie, overwhelmed by the mounting strangeness of her circumstances, often let them go unanswered. One evening, Maxie decided she couldn't ignore her instincts any longer. She went to the Quartermaine mansion unannounced, determined to confront Tracy directly. The conversation was as tense as she had expected. Tracy met her in the sitting room, her expression unreadable, her voice steady as she reminded Maxie that going to the police would ruin everyone, including herself. Maxie accused her of intimidation, but Tracy only smiled faintly, a predator humoring its prey. The exchange ended without resolution, but Maxie left with a heavier sense of foreboding. She could tell Tracy was not trying to dissuade her anymore. She was simply waiting for something. The following week, the waiting ended. Maxie arrived at Deception one morning to find two detectives standing outside her office. They were polite but firm, informing her that she needed to come with them to answer questions regarding financial irregularities tied to the company. Lucy rushed to her side, demanding to know what was going on, but the detectives were tight-lipped. Maxie's heart pounded as she was led out of the building, flashes of cameras from a gossip reporter she hadn't even noticed until that moment sealing her humiliation. At the police station, the evidence was laid out in front of her, emails, signed agreements, and financial ledgers that all pointed directly at her as the person responsible for accepting Sunny's tainted investment. The sheer volume of it was staggering. She recognized some of the documents but had never seen others before in her life. When she protested, the detectives exchanged a look that told her they had already decided she was guilty. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Tracy sipped her tea and listened to Brooke Lynn's hesitant voice recount what had happened. Brooke Lynn's guilt was palpable, but Tracy dismissed it with a wave of her hand. In her mind, the plan was not only working but closing in on its endgame. If Maxie took the fall, the rest of them would remain untouched, and Deception would survive. The public might take a temporary interest in the scandal, but the machine would keep running. Brooke Lynn, however, could not stop thinking about the look on Maxie's face as she was led away. It haunted her through the night, and she began to wonder how long she could keep the secret before it consumed her. Lucy was not as restrained. She began her own quiet investigation, determined to prove Maxie's innocence. She retraced every step of the investment process, interviewing former staff members, and digging into Natalia's files. It was during one of these late-night searches through Natalia's old office that she found something curious, a handwritten note in Natalia's distinctive script that seemed to suggest she had been worried about someone within Deception trying to redirect accountability. The note did not mention Tracy by name, but Lucy's mind immediately went there. She now had a thread, and she intended to pull it until the whole tapestry unraveled. As the case against Maxie moved forward, the courtroom became the new battlefield. The prosecution painted her as a cunning opportunist, someone who had exploited Natalia's trust and Sunny's resources for personal gain. Maxie sat through the proceedings in a state of stunned disbelief, her lawyer struggling to counter the meticulously crafted story. Outside the courthouse, whispers began to circulate. Some believed Maxie, others saw her as guilty. For Tracy, the mixed public opinion was irrelevant. The law didn't care about gossip, it cared about proof, and she had made sure the proof was in place. But the longer the trial went on, the more cracks began to form in the facade. Lucy's investigation started to yield results, small inconsistencies in the forged documents, subtle mismatches in email metadata, and a financial transfer that led to a shadow account connected not to Maxie but to a shell company Tracy had once used in an unrelated business venture. Brooke Lynn, too, began to slip, her guilt manifesting in small but noticeable ways. She avoided eye contact with Tracy, stumbled over her words when questioned by friends, and even considered going to Maxie's lawyer to tell the truth. The weight of complicity was becoming unbearable. The turning point came when Lucy confronted Brooke Lynn privately, presenting her with the evidence she had gathered so far. Brooke Lynn's defenses crumbled, and she admitted to knowing more than she had ever let on. She stopped short of confessing everything, but Lucy could see the cracks widening. It was only a matter of time before the truth came out, and when it did, the fallout would be catastrophic, not just for Tracy, but for everyone who had gone along with her plan. The question now was whether they could stop the conviction before it was too late, or if Maxie would be sentenced before the truth saw the light of day. The trial's final week opened under a sky the color of steel, and the atmosphere in Port Charles felt just as heavy. Maxie sat at the defense table, her gaze locked forward, every muscle in her body tense. She had stopped trying to read the jurors' expressions days ago. Her lawyer kept whispering that they still had a chance, that the case wasn't over, but Maxie could feel the noose tightening. The prosecution had been relentless, hammering home the forged documents, the suspicious transfers, and her alleged connection to Sunny's money. To the public, it was an open and shut case. Lucy knew the clock was running out. The evidence she and Brooke Lynn had uncovered was damning, for Tracy, not for Maxie, but proving it in time was the challenge. The shell company tied to Tracy was the keystone, but without direct proof linking her to the forged documents, the prosecution could still claim coincidence. Brooke Lynn was the missing piece. She had been present during key moments, had overheard Tracy's calls, had even helped file away documents that later turned up as evidence against Maxie. The problem was getting her to speak on the record. Fear was a lock around her throat, but Lucy could see it weakening with each day that passed. On the third day of the week, Lucy took a risk. She slipped into the Quartermaine mansion while Tracy was out, under the pretense of dropping off something for Brooke Lynn. Once inside, she handed Brooke Lynn a flash drive containing all the evidence she had gathered. "If you do nothing, Maxie will spend years in prison for something she didn't do," Lucy said, her voice low and urgent. "And you'll have to live with the fact that you could have stopped it." Brooke Lynn's hand shook as she took the drive. That night, she stayed awake replaying every moment of the past months, the meetings, the whispers, the lies, and realized she couldn't live with the weight of it any longer. The next morning, Brooke Lynn walked into the courthouse before testimony began and went straight to Maxie's lawyer. She asked to speak off the record first, then began to talk. At first her voice faltered, but once she started telling the truth, it poured out of her. She described Tracy's plan, the forged handwriting, the planted documents, and the shell company. By the time she finished, the lawyer's expression had shifted from cautious skepticism to sharp focus. They would need corroboration, but Brooke Lynn's testimony could be the lever to pry the entire case apart. In court, the defense requested an emergency recess. The judge, irritated but curious, granted it. Within hours, a motion was filed to admit new evidence and recall witnesses. The prosecution fought it bitterly, accusing the defense of theatrics, but the judge allowed it. When Brooke Lynn took the stand, the room fell silent. Her voice was steadier than she expected as she laid out the truth, each detail tightening the vice around Tracy's carefully built lie. She didn't spare herself, she admitted to staying quiet out of fear, to being complicit by omission. The jurors watched her closely, their expressions shifting in ways Maxie hadn't dared hope for. Tracy, seated in the gallery, didn't flinch outwardly, but the flicker in her eyes betrayed her. She knew the tide was turning. By the time the defense presented the paper trail from the shell company to Tracy's own business dealings, the prosecution's case looked brittle. The lead detective, recalled to the stand, admitted under cross-examination that they had never considered Tracy as a suspect because all the evidence pointed to Maxie from the start, a fact that now seemed less like coincidence and more like manipulation. On the final day of the trial, the jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning with a verdict, not guilty on all counts. The relief in the courtroom was palpable, but Maxie didn't celebrate. She sat frozen, absorbing the reality that she was free while knowing how close she had come to losing everything. When she finally stood, her eyes went to Brooke Lynn, and for a long moment they just looked at each other, two people who would never see the world the same way again. Tracy didn't wait for the fallout. That night, she began quietly moving her assets and making arrangements to leave town. But Port Charles has a way of holding on to its villains. The DA's office opened a new investigation within days, this time with Tracy in the crosshairs. Lucy fed them everything she had, determined to see the story through to its real ending. Brooke Lynn agreed to testify again, fully aware that this time, she would be burning every bridge with her family. The idea of Tracy facing her own day in court was no longer a fantasy, it was a matter of time. Maxie, meanwhile, began the slow process of putting her life back together. Deception was in chaos, its reputation battered by the scandal, but she returned to the office with a quiet determination. Lucy stood by her, already working on a rebranding plan to salvage what they could. Brooke Lynn offered to help too, though Maxie didn't accept immediately. Trust would take time. The scars from what had happened weren't just on paper. They were personal, etched deep into friendships and alliances that might never fully heal. Weeks later, as Maxie walked along the harbor one evening, she spotted Tracy across the water being led into a police car. There were no cameras this time, no crowd, just the quiet click of the cuffs and the sight of someone who had finally run out of moves. Maxie didn't smile, but she felt something shift inside her. Justice in Port Charles was rarely simple, but sometimes, it still found its way through the cracks. Lucy joined her at the pier, and for a while they just stood together, watching the water. "It's over," Lucy said softly. Maxie nodded, but she knew better than to believe it entirely. In this town, nothing was ever truly over. Still, for the first time in months, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. Whatever came next, she was ready for it.